and your perspective on your life. And that's why storytelling is so essential and critical. And what's fascinating is that when Moshe Rabbeinu leads the Jews to freedom in this week's Torah portion, the first thing he tells them is, and you shall relate to your children, on the night of Passover, tell them the story. And here Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatest prophet, the greatest leader, led the Jews to victory. And what does he do? The most important thing is, if you want to sustain this freedom, if you want to maintain the story and its lessons and its implications, you need to always relate the story to the children. And this is, again, another primary example of how Judaism puts the greatest emphasis on education. Education is what perpetuates memory and education, and perpetuating the memory and the lessons we learned from our lives to our children and to the next generation. And that's really the beauty of the night of Seder, and why it's so attractive, and why so many Jews participate in it, because we look to our parents, to our grandparents, and we say, tell us your story, so we can tell that story one day to our children and our grandchildren. But let us begin on page 340, the beginning of this week's Torah portion. And now the name of the Torah portion is Bo. Now Bo literally means come. Why is that called a portion of Bo? Because the opening word says, God told Moses, Bo el Paro, come to Pharaoh. Now the first question is, why does it say come to Pharaoh? It should have said Lech el Paro, go to Pharaoh. Just like God told Abraham, Lech lecha, go to Pharaoh. And God goes on to say, because I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, in order to perform these signs of mine in his midst. And the very next verse, as we just discussed, and in order so that you will relate in the ears of your son and your son's son that I made a mockery of Egypt and my signs that I placed among them, that you may know that I am Hashem. God says to Moses, I have more miracles to perform, more plagues, number 7, number 8, number 9, number 10, 8, 9, 10 in this week's Torah portion, because I want to make the story more wondrous about my miracles and my signs. So you'll tell your children about all the miracles, all the plagues that God brought upon the Egyptians to free the Jewish people, to stand up for the justice and the freedom of the impoverished, enslaved Jewish nation. But the first question is on the very name of the Parsha. Why is it called come to Pharaoh? Should the name not have been go to Pharaoh? And the answer is quite obvious. When I say come, what I'm saying is that you're coming along with me. I am going as well. And Moses was disheartened, reluctant to go to Pharaoh, because he felt Pharaoh was stubborn. He was obstinate. He would not change his ways. It was a waste of his time. He had attempted 7 times to impress upon Pharaoh the importance of freeing the Jewish people, and to no avail. And every time Pharaoh committed to allowing the Jewish people to go free, he reneged on his promise. So why should I bother going again for the 8th time, and then the 9th time, and the 10th time? And therefore God says, come to Pharaoh, because I am going with you. And since I'm going with you, you have nothing to fear. And you know that we will prevail because you have God with you. It's interesting that the word bo, come, is 2 letters, the first and the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, bet and aleph. Bet is 2, aleph is 1. And it's sort of like saying it's 2 on 1. When a Jew goes to do the right thing, he goes with God. And therefore he will overpower whatever obstacle or whatever force may try to stand in his way. He will prevail and succeed. And that's really the source of Jewish optimism. You know, there's a story about they say, what's the difference between a Jewish optimist and a Jewish pessimist? So they say, a Jewish pessimist says things can't get any worse. And the Jewish optimist says, oh, yes, they can. So what does it mean to be a Jewish optimist? To be a Jewish optimist means they have faith in God. And because I have faith in God, I know everything's going to be good. And even if it's not good, I believe it's for the best. There's a reason for it. Optimism is not just blind belief that everything is going to be good. Because, you know, some people say, I'm not an optimist, I'm not a pessimist, I'm a realist. why shouldn't I be a realist? Why should I be an optimist? And the answer is you should be an optimist because you should know that whenever you're doing the right thing, whenever you're setting out on a mission, you're embarking on a task that God would approve of, God would be pleased with, God would endorse, because you're doing God's will in this world, you're trying to achieve his goals, his objectives, then God is with you. You're not going to Pharaoh, you're coming to Pharaoh with God. And if you always know God is with you, supporting you and helping you, then of course you have confidence that you will succeed. And that's the source of Jewish optimism. So the Parsha begins with the 8th plague. The 8th plague was the plague of locusts that swarmed Egypt. And once again, Pharaoh tries to negotiate with Moses. And it's very interesting, the negotiations that he tries to have with Moses to bring an end to this 8th plague of locusts. And what does he say? In verse 8 of this week's Torah portion, chapter 10 of Exodus, verse 8, Paro says to Moses and Aaron, okay, because initially Moses and Aaron said that we're just going on a holiday to serve God and we will return. So he said, who and who is going? Give me the list of travelers on this trip. Who's heading out of Egypt? And what does Moses say? With our youngsters and with our elders shall we go. With our sons and with our daughters. With our flock and with our cattle shall we go. Because it is a festival of Hashem for us. In other words, Moses says, we're all going. Men, women, children, elderly, young, even our animals are coming with us because we have to offer sacrifices to God. And here's where Paro says, I'll tell you what, I'll let you go, but only the adults will go to serve God, because that's what you're asking for, service of God. Why do you need the children? And because Moses insists on taking the youth, the children, he drives them out of the palace and refuses to let the Jewish people go. And our rabbis say this is a very important fundamental lesson in Judaism, and that is that when we serve God, it can't just be the elders. You know, at Mount Sinai, when God offered the Torah to the Jewish people, it says that the Jewish people were told by God, God said, give me a guarantee that you're going to keep the Torah. And who will be the guarantors? And the Jews said, the rabbis, the prophets, the elders, and God rejected all of those guarantors. It was only when the Jews at Mount Sinai said to God, our children will be our guarantors, only then did God agree to give the Torah to the Jewish people. If you want to secure the continuity of the Jewish people and Jewish observance, you have to teach the children, as it says in the Shema. And therefore Moses says to Pharaoh, we will not go without our youth, because if we're going to serve God, we need to have the children with us. Because in Judaism, the parents have to serve alongside the children, because the children have to learn from the parents so that one day they can be parents and they can, God willing, teach their children. So as a result of that, the Egyptians are struck with the locusts, with the arba. And the locust eats up all the vegetation of the land and destroys any other produce that the hail, which was the 7th plague, had not already destroyed. And the verse says, no greenery remained on the trees or the grass of the field in the entire land of Egypt. So now Paro summons Moses and says, okay, I'm going to let you go. But of course, he hardens his heart and does not allow the Jewish people to go. And now we come to the 9th plague, which is in the Blue Oscar Chumash on page 344. Now, this plague is, of course, the 9th plague, which is the plague of darkness. There was darkness for 3 days in the land of Egypt. Now, what's unique about darkness is that it, in a way, it's not much of a plague because it doesn't destroy anything. It doesn't harm anyone. So what was the meaning of this plague, the 9th plague? So when we look at the 10 plagues, we see that there were miracles and they were signs, meaning the point of the plagues was not just to harm or to punish the Egyptians, but also to communicate a message to them. And the message was the sign that God was trying to show them to encourage them to change their evil ways and allow the Jewish people to go free. And so darkness represents the state of the of the Egyptians, that God was saying to them, you are a society, you are a nation that is dwelling in darkness. What is the idea of darkness? The idea of darkness, of course, is that when there's darkness, when you're in a dark room, everything in the room exists. It's just that you don't see it. And the idea of a person living in darkness means that they're blind to the plight of others. And that's what God was trying to communicate to the Egyptians through this ninth plague of darkness, that they were a country, a society that was evil and was dwelling in darkness. Just like the first plague of the blood was a sign to the Egyptians that your Nile is filled with blood, because the blood of the babies that were drowned in the Nile are resurfacing and the entire Nile is turning to blood. It was a message to the Egyptians that you have a blood-drenched Nile. So too this ninth plague represented the idea of darkness that had descended on Egypt, that had become a dark and an evil society. So once again, after the ninth plague, Paro calls Moses back. And this time he's continuing the negotiations from before. And he says, okay, I'll tell you what. You could go free, and you could even take your children, but leave your cattle behind. So I'll let you take the kids, just leave the cattle behind. And listen to Moses' answer. Not only doesn't Moses agree to Paro to leave the cattle behind, but he actually says to Pharaoh, not only are we going to take our cattle, but you are going to give us some of your cattle, because we need to take as many animals as we can out of Egypt, because when we come to the wilderness, we will not know how many offerings we will have to bring to God, and we may need more than we have in our possession. So we're going to insist that you give us some of your animals as well. They say the best defense is a good offense. Well, this was the best offense, telling Paro, not only won't we compromise with you to leave behind, God forbid, our children or even our cattle, we won't leave behind, but we're actually going to demand that you give us some of your livestock. And once again, Paro says, leave my presence. I don't want to see your face again. And if I see your face again, you will die. And Moses once again leaves the palace. We're now up to chapter 11 in Exodus, the portion of Bo. And here we come to a little interlude. Before we come to the final plague, the one right after darkness is the killing of the firstborn, which of course is when the Jews had to tie the sheep on the bedpost and put the blood on the doorpost and prepare for God to pass over. That's why it's called Passover. God passed over the Jewish homes when he struck the firstborn in Egypt. So before that, there's 3 verses, the first 3 verses of chapter 11. And what happens in these 3 verses? God says to Moses, listen, I'm about to bring the last plague on Egypt. And this plague is going to devastate them. This will break their stubbornness, break their back, and they're going to allow the Jews to ask you to do me a favor. Now, I'm being very precise, because normally when God tells us to do things, he doesn't ask us for favors, right? He says, God told Moses, tell the Jewish people, do such and such. It's a commandment. The word mitzvah literally means a commandment. So God gives commandments because he's God. He tells us what to do. He doesn't say, do me a favor, please do this for me. But here, there is the word na. God says, daber na, please ask the people to do this for me. What is this favor that God is asking for? So the verse goes on to say asked them to ask their Egyptian neighbors for gold and silver. And God says, I will give favor in the eyes of the Egyptians to the Jewish people, and they will give you willingly their gold and silver if you just ask for it. And when the Jewish people leave Egypt, they will not just leave with their families and with their animals, but they'll leave wealthy with gold and silver. And that's actually what happened. The Jews turned to their Egyptian neighbors and said, we're leaving. Could you give us some gold and silver as gifts or lend it to us? And the Egyptians gave it to them, and they left with great wealth. Unfortunately, they ended up using a lot of that gold and silver for the golden calf, which is a separate discussion. But God wanted them to go out with gold and silver. So why did God want them to leave with gold and silver? And why did God have to phrase it as a favor? So rabbis say that the Jews were like, we just want to leave. Forget about gold and silver. We just want to go free. Forget about the money. So God says to Moses, Moshe, do me a favor. Ask the Jews to please ask their Egyptian neighbors. I know they're ready to go empty-handed, but I want them to go with great wealth. Why? Because if you remember, God told Abraham at the Brit Ben Absarim, which is the covenant between the parts, that your descendants will be slaves in Egypt, and then they will go out with great wealth. So the Midrash says that God says to Moses, I don't want Abraham to say to me, well, God, you kept the first half of the promise, but not the second part. The first part, which was they're going to be slaves in Egypt, that you fulfill. But the second part, that they're going to grow out with great wealth, you didn't fulfill. So I want you to ask the Jews to please ask for the wealth of the Egyptians so they go out with wealth. So Abraham won't have any complaints that I didn't fulfill the promise that they'll go out with great wealth. But here's the question. Why was it important for them to take this wealth? Why did God tell Abraham they're going to go out with wealth and now insist that before they leave, they first collect the wealth of their Egyptian neighbors? And the answer is, when you look at the life and the legacy of Moshe Rabbeinu, and we're reading now the 10 plagues and the last 3 plagues, and they go out of Egypt and they splits the sea. And our commentators say that all the 10 plagues, each plague lasted about a month. So it was about a year's worth of work on the part of Moshe, from the time he went to Paro to the time he got the Jews across the Red Sea and got them to Mount Sinai to get the Torah. But it turns out in hindsight that this wasn't the most difficult part of Moses' job. The next 40 years or the next 39 years were the most difficult portion of his lifetime. Because for 40 years, the Jews were in the desert, and we know how many troubles, how many rebellions and sins the Jews committed. The sin of the spies, the sin of the golden calf, complaining about the water, complaining about the food, nonstop quarrels and grumbling on behalf of the Jews. And the wilderness was a very difficult journey for the Jewish people. And it's understandable. Why? Because you're taking a people out of 210 years of slavery. That's many generations. And, God forbid if somebody's in prison for 20, 30 years, they say they become institutionalized, right? They lost their internal freedom. Imagine if your father was a slave, your grandfather was a slave, your children are slaves. That's all you know. And now, that's why Moses had to be the one to take the Jews out of Egypt, because he was the only one who was not raised as a slave. He was a prince in Egypt, and then he ran away to Midian, and he was raised in a free society. So he had a mindset of a free person. But the slaves, they thought like slaves, and they experienced life with a mindset and mentality of being enslaved. And as the saying goes, it's easier to take the Jews out of Egypt than to take Egypt out of the Jews. And that's why they had to wander for 40 years. They couldn't go into freedom into the land of Israel. It had to be the next generation that was born in the desert that went into Israel, because that generation, they were, so to speak, beyond rehabilitation. And that's why they were never happy. They were, always discontented and complaining and not appreciative because of their internal lack of confidence and security. And no matter how many miracles God performed for them, it couldn't God could change nature and perform miracles, but it can't change human nature. That's your free will. And therefore he could not change them. And that's why they relapsed. into golden calves. And when God wanted to take them to the land of Israel, they were fearful that they can't conquer the land. The land is too strong and mighty. The people are too mighty. And they lived in constant fear and insecurity. And therefore, God says they're going to have to wander for 40 years till that whole generation dies out. And so, how do you get a person who's been a slave for hundreds of years to regain faith in themselves? And so therefore God says they need to ask for gold and silver from the Egyptians. Why? Because the Egyptians had to acknowledge their wrongdoing, admit, accept responsibility, and atone for it to some degree by giving what you would call today reparations to these former slaves. So at least when they went out free, they felt that they were compensated for their hundreds of years of slavery. And there was an acknowledgement of the Egyptians that they did wrong by the Jews, and they were paying, so to speak, by giving them their gold and silver. And hopefully that would help ease the pain and the sense of worthlessness that the Jews had after hundreds of years of being oppressed and enslaved and beaten and their babies drowned in the Nile, and overcome this trauma. And again, I use the word reparations. Germany gave reparations after the Holocaust to Israel, as you know, is a big debate in the Knesset whether she accepted it, whether Menachem Begin said it's blood money, we shouldn't accept it, but Israel took it because they felt they couldn't survive as a nation without it. But can money compensate for the loss of the lives of 6 million Jews? No. But the fact that the Germans pay this money every year, it's acknowledgement of their guilt and their responsibility, and that helps the victim recover. And that's also true, in our society, when sometimes you read in the news that people were falsely imprisoned and they acknowledge that they made a mistake and they decide to let the person go free, and the government will write them a large check. Not that the check can make up for 20 or 30 years of imprisonment falsely, but at least the person feels, okay, the government acknowledged that they tried me falsely, unjustly, and they're compensating me. And that helps the person regain and rehabilitate their sense of self after what they've endured. So God tells Moses, please ask the Jewish people to borrow or to ask of their Egyptian neighbors for gold and silver. Now, when you ask the question, someone just asked the question, and I welcome questions, of course, why would the Egyptians give the departing Jews gold and silver? And the answer is in the verse. The verse says, Vayitein Hashem et chen ha'am b'nei Mitzrayim, that God put the favor of the Jews in the eyes of the Egyptians so that they had favor in their eyes and were willing to give them their gold and silver. Now, later on, we know that the Jews worshiped a golden calf. And you say, where did they get all this gold? And the answer is they got it from their Egyptian neighbors. And I'll just tell you something very fascinating. When Moshe Rabbeinu had to defend the Jews after the golden calf, a defense attorney, sometimes he has a good defense. Sometimes he has nothing to say. The evidence is clear. The guy committed a crime, but the defense attorney still has to get up and make a defense. So based on a verse in the Torah, the rabbis say, what was Moses' defense? He pleads for forgiveness for the Jewish people after they worshiped the golden calf. But what was his defense? And one of the defenses that the rabbis point out that Moses made was, and I'll give it to you by way of analogy. This is not my analogy. This is the Midrash's analogy. The Midrash says that Moses says to God, imagine a father who takes his son and he grooms him and he fits him in beautiful tailored clothing. And then he hangs a bag of gold coins around his neck. And now his son has all these beautiful clothing and fragrances and well-groomed, and he puts this bag of gold coins around his neck. And he seats the son at the door of a house of ill repute, of harlotry. And then the father discovers the next day that his son committed some indecent, shameful acts. Says the Medrash, would the father be surprised? He has no one to blame but himself. you set your child up for that by giving them all the gold and making them look so beautiful and attractive and putting them at a door of ill repute. This to God. God, you insisted right here that the Jews take all this gold from their Egyptian neighbors. What did you think they were going to do with all this gold in the desert? So now that they make a golden calf, you're upset, you're surprised, you're shocked, you're disappointed. Who gave them all this gold in the first place? And it shows what a great leader Moses was, that he defended the Jewish people at all costs. But it was also a very practical lesson that sometimes we could overindulge our children, and then later they disappoint us in the way they live. And we say, well, why did they do this? And the answer is, well, look at what you've given them. You spoil them. You indulge them. And as a result of that, it led to this lifestyle. So this is the insistence that God says. Now, the question that someone just asked is, well, wouldn't God know that this was going to happen? And the answer is yes, God knows everything. And we spoke about this on Sunday in our Jewish course of why. God knows everything, no question about that. However, although God knows everything, God gives every person free will. So the intention of the gold and the silver was to help the Jews gain their own self-worth and confidence, that they should feel at least that the Egyptians exploited them as slaves, but at least they were made to pay a price. There was justice served, and that they were given some compensation for the slavery. The fact that they chose to use that gold to make a golden calf, that was their choice. And Moses tries to use it as a defense of the Jewish people, but ultimately, God does forgive the Jewish people out of compassion. It's really not a defense, but Moses tries to defend the Jewish people in that way. But at the end of the day, God allows us to choose whether we're going to use what he gives us as a blessing or, God forbid, the opposite. So now we come to the last plague, the 10th plague, which is the killing of the firstborn in Egypt. And what does the verse say? And we talked about darkness, right? It's interesting that this plague specifically occurred at midnight, which is like the peak of darkness. God says to Moshe, go tell Pharaoh that at midnight I'm going to come into Egypt and I will kill every firstborn in the land of Egypt. And our rabbis point out that it doesn't say at midnight, it says kachatzot, at about, around the time of midnight. Now, why did God not just say at midnight when the clock strikes 12? Why does it say kachatzot, at around the time of midnight? And our rabbis in the Midrash say that God was concerned that maybe the clocks of the Egyptians will be off by a minute. And the Egyptians will say, God said midnight, but it's 11:59 or it's 12:01 or 12:02. You see, God's not right. We have nothing to fear. So therefore, God specifically made sure it was not precise and said around midnight. So even if your clock is off by a drop, you'll still know it was me who brought this plague. And that's the reason the Midrash says why God said at about midnight. But the question is, if you're an Egyptian, especially if you already witnessed 9 plagues, and God says at midnight, even if you think your clock is right and it's off by a minute, would that disqualify the miracle? But that's human nature. Human nature is that when we don't want to accept something, we'll find any reason, even if it's not very rational, to reject what it is, even if the overwhelming evidence seems to support this position. We'll find a way out, so to speak, to say, well, this didn't occur the way this was supposed to occur, and so on and so forth, and to sort of eliminate the responsibility and the onus that it puts upon ourselves. So Moses warns Pharaoh, and what is Pharaoh's response? Pharaoh's response, once again, is that he does not heed the warning of Moses and refuses to allow the Jewish people to go free. And just want to point out something interesting, that nowhere in the first 9 plagues does it tell us what Moses's emotional response was to Paro's stubbornness. However, this is the first time where it says that when Moses left the palace of Pharaoh, after this last warning and Paro is still being obstinate, Moses left Paro's palace with burning anger. Now, never before did it say that he was angry at Paro, he lost his temper at him, or he was upset. The first time. And the answer is because all the other plagues were reversible. The blood, the Nile turned to blood, then it went back to water once Paro agreed to let the Jews go. The frogs came, the frogs went. The lice came, the lice left. But here, people were going to die. The firstborn in every household were going to die. And yet Paro didn't care. Even though after the plague goes away and the Jews agree, even though after that the Jews will go free, the plague will stop, but the people who died didn't come back to life again. So when Moses sees what a despot, what a dictator he was, Pharaoh, that he didn't care about the plight of the Jews, that he was willing to allow them to die. I'm sorry, not just the Jews, but even his own people, the firstborn. This infuriated Moses to the point that he lost his temper and he left Paro, as the verse says, in a burning anger. How could a man be so evil to not care about the plight of all the firstborn in all the households in his land? And now we come to chapter 12 of this week's Torah portion. Now, this is a very interesting chapter. Why? Because the very first Rashi, the commentary of Rashi of Shlomo Yitzchaki, if you go back to the beginning of the Torah that we started reading on Simchas Torah, it says, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And the very first Rashi asks the very first question on the entire commentary of the Torah. You know what the question is? In a nutshell, the question is, why does the Torah start with Bereshit, in the beginning God created the heaven and earth? The Torah should start from chapter 12 in the portion of Bo, which is what we're up to now. What is the logic of Rashi's question? The very first commandment given to the Jewish people is about to be studied and given right now. So Rashi asks, why do we start with the creation of the world? If the Torah is a book of instructions for the Jewish people, it should begin with the very first instruction, which is the mitzvah of the Paschal offering and the celebration of Passover. And the mitzvah that began that entire section is the very first mitzvah given to the Jewish people, which is Rosh Chodesh. So Rashi asks from this commandment to observe it. And we won't get into what the answer is from Rashi, because that's not relevant right now. But the fact of the matter remains that the Torah does not begin with the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people. It begins with the stories of the patriarchs and the matriarchs and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Adam and Eve, and all those stories. But now, right here, if you're in the Blue Art Scroll Chumash, page 348, chapter 12, or in any Chumash you're in, chapter 12 of the book of Exodus, is the very first commandment given to the Jewish nation. Now, we know there are 613 commandments, but what's the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people? And it's a mitzvah that we just observed a few days ago. We just observed it on Thursday. This past Thursday was Rosh Chodesh Shvat, the first day of the month of Shvat. Just like there's Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, which is also Rosh Chodesh. It's the head of the month of Tishrei, but it's also the head of the whole year. Every month has a mini Rosh Hashanah. It's the head of the month, Rosh Chodesh. And it's a minor holiday. There's certain things we don't do on that day, especially a holiday for women. And we don't say certain sad prayers on that day. It's considered a joyous day because it's the first day of the month. It's the rebirth of the moon. And the very first commandment given to the Jewish people was to observe Rosh Chodesh, to start following the lunar calendar. The Jewish people follow the cycle of the moon. That's why we have leap years to catch up with the solar calendar. And the Jewish people are told, HaChodesh Hazeh, this month of Nisan, which is the month of Passover, is Rosh Chodeshim, is the head of all the months. Now, why is it important to know when Rosh Chodesh is? Because every holiday is based on a day in the calendar. So the Jews go out of Egypt on the 15th day of the month, and hence every year, the 15th of Nisan, we observe Passover from the 14th in the evening, sunset. Well, you only know when the 15th is if you know when Rosh Chodesh is. So you have to have a calendar with months. That's the practical reason. If you're going to observe a Jewish calendar, Passover, and holidays, you have to know when Rosh Chodesh is. So the first commandment is to have Rosh Chodesh. But there's other deeper reasons why this is the number one commandment from all the commandments. You may think Rosh Chodesh is a minor holiday. Why is this the first commandment given to the Jewish people? And I'd like to share two reasons. One is that up until now, the Jews were slaves. Now, as a slave, you really don't need a calendar because you have no appointments. You just do what you're told to do whenever you're told to do it. You're a slave. You have no freedom to choose how to spend your time. The greatest gift God gave us is life. But what is really life? Life is time. And that's why we pray for a long life, because we want a lot of time. We want more time. But in one word, time equals life. Unfortunately, people say time is money. But time is much more valuable than money. Time is life. That's why, God forbid, if someone's sick, they'll pay any amount of money to prolong their life, because life is much more valuable than money, obviously. So time isn't money. That's trivializing and materializing time. Time is life. It's the greatest gift is, then just like people weigh how to spend their money, you don't just throw your money away. You don't just waste your money. You don't squander your money. You don't burn your money. You think how to spend it and how to invest it. How can I get the best return on my money? Where should I put it? And before you do something with your money, you think about it. Is it worth the amount of money, right? Sadly, people don't treat their time as precious. But if we just said that time is much more valuable than money, because if someone's sick, they'll pay any amount of money to buy more time, right? Yet people, as they often use the term, kill time, have some time to kill and squander time. Well, if you wouldn't kill money or squander money or waste money, why would you waste time? And the biggest choice we have to make in life is not how we spend our money, because money comes and money goes. You could always make back the money you lost. You can't make back the time you lost. Time lost can never be regained. That time will never come back. So if we're so careful how we spend our money and where we invest our money, we have to be even more careful how we spend our time and where we invest our time. Do we invest our time in trivial things? Do we invest our time in making money? Or do we invest our time in our relationships with our family and friends and with Hashem above all? So the very first commandment is monitoring and measuring time. That's what calendar is. It's a measurement of time, days, weeks, months, so on and so forth. And so the very first commandment is, now that you're free, by definition, a free person has mastery and control over their time. Up until now, you didn't control your time. Now your time is in your possession. And realize that's the most precious gift. And that's the first commandment, to establish a Jewish calendar so that you could maintain and utilize your time correctly. So this is the real message of freedom. We live in the freest society today, but the real definition of freedom is the freedom to choose how to spend our time. And it's interesting when you look at the calendar. There's a story told about this guy who was an atheist, and he's always debating with his rabbi, and he says, "Rabbi, I want to get together and talk about God, because I don't believe in God." And the rabbi said, "Okay, when do you want to get together?" He said, "You tell me." So the rabbi said, "When's good for you?" So the guy said, "How about next week?" The rabbi said, "Next week? What does that mean?" "What do you mean? What does that mean? Next week?" He says, "I don't know what that word is." He says, week, WEEK, next week. He said, "I don't know what a week is." He said, "What do you mean you don't know what a week is?" The rabbi says to the guy, "Listen, I know what a day is. Sunrise, sunset, I see that. that's a day. I know what a month is, the lunar calendar, right? Every 29, 30 days, the moon gets bigger. The first half of the month it dwindles till it's invisible, and then it's reborn again. So I know what that is. He says, I know what a year is, the solar cycle, 365 days of the year. He says, but what changes in nature every 7 days? Nothing changes from 1 week to the next. So where did the week come from? The only place you have a source of a week is in the Bible. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. But if you don't believe in God, why do you use weeks? You should erase all weeks from your calendar because God created weeks. Weeks is not the phenomenon in nature. The point being is that the Jewish people follow the calendar and we follow specifically the moon. Why the moon? So the fundamental difference, there's two fundamental differences between the moon and the sun. One fundamental difference is that the sun has its own innate light. The moon reflects the light of the sun. Jewish people are compared to the moon because our purpose in this world is to reflect God's light, which means no matter what greatness we have inside of ourselves, whatever potential or skills we have, we always have to realize that's just God's light reflected through us. Hashem is the light. We are the vessel that receives and reflects his light in the world. So that's one reason why we're compared to the moon. Another reason we're compared to the moon is because the sun is always stable, meaning it's always at a fixed size and strength. It doesn't, it doesn't weaken or strengthen. It doesn't wax or wane. The moon, as we all know, it builds momentum for the first half of the month. Then it begins to wane until it becomes practically invisible. And then there's a rebirth of the moon each month. And what God's telling the Jewish people is, you are like the moon. There are certain nations are very strong, like the sun, very powerful, but they only exist for a certain amount of time, and then they fade from the horizon, so to speak. The Jewish people are like the moon. We've had our ups and downs throughout history. We've had glorious moments, and we've had very depressed times and periods of persecution and extinction. And there were some times that the light of the moon is almost invisible, meaning the Jewish people look like they're about to fade, about to disappear forever, never to return. But suddenly there's a rebirth of the moon. There's a revival, a resurgence, an awakening, and the moon begins to grow in its momentum. And that's the message of the Jewish people being like the moon. Never count us out. We may seem like we're gone. We may be written off by the historians or those who are the pundits who try to predict the future, but never try to predict the future, because as God is eternal, the Jewish people are eternal. And no greater example needs to be given than tragically in our generation. After the Holocaust, 6 million brothers and sisters, Jewish people were murdered. 1945, it looked as though the Jewish people were permanently, God forbid, decimated. And 3 years later, 3 years after coming eyeball to eyeball with the angel of death, suddenly there was a revival. We came back to Eretz Yisrael after 1900 years of exile and reestablished our roots in our ancestral homeland. That is like the rebirth of the moon in our generation. And this has been the story of the Jewish people throughout. The commandment to eat the Paschal lamb, each family, the idea of the family unit being strong is always essential to the Jewish people. And therefore, the very first commandment, and someone just asked, by the way, why is it that the day starts in the evening? That goes back to the 6 days of creation. Every day of creation, it says, and it was evening and it was morning, day one. And it was evening and it was morning, day two. The evening precedes the morning. Symbolically, what it represents is that darkness precedes light. And ultimately, light triumphs over darkness. So therefore, the day begins, in our calendar, Gregorian calendar, the two bookends of each day is darkness, the darkness from midnight till the morning and the darkness from sundown to midnight. But in the Jewish calendar, it begins with night, but ultimately transforms into light, which is the direction of the whole world, that it will ultimately emerge into the Messianic era of great light. So going back, the Torah says that each family should take a sheep and tie it to the bedpost and then offer it as a sacrifice, and have the courage to put the blood on their doorpost, to defy their Egyptian neighbors, to see the Jews were building up, to use a modern day analogy, antibodies. The Jews were very fearful of the Egyptians. just like people during Corona hiding in their houses, so to speak, right? But each plague built the Jewish people's immune system and their antibodies, that they don't have to be afraid of the Egyptians, because the Egyptians were struck and the Jews were spared every one of the 12 plagues. So the esteem and the honor of the Jews started to grow, and the Jews started to build confidence and trust in God. And now they had the courage to sacrifice the sheep, which was the idol of Egypt that they worship, and put the door in the blood. This is a Jewish home. Like some people may be afraid to put a mezuzah on their door, or they're ashamed to put a mezuzah on their door. Or if you live, God forbid, in an anti-Semitic place, you want to put your mezuzah inside the door because you don't want your non-Jewish neighbors to know you're Jewish, you're afraid. Well, imagine being a slave in Egypt. You didn't want to identify as a Jew. But now they had the courage to put the blood on the doorpost. And that was essential to go free. The Jews had to first have the ability to stand up for who they are, to not cower in fear from their Egyptian neighbors. Because the first step in freedom is to believe in yourself, and that's why God wanted them to take this sheep, which was the idol of Egypt, slaughter it, put the blood on the doorpost, and then God said, I will pass over the Jewish homes when I strike all the firstborn in Egypt, when I come to free the Jewish people. And it's interesting that the holiday is called Pesach, Passover. Now, first of all, why is it called Passover? After all, that's just one detail in the whole story. You had 10 plagues, and one detail was that God passed over the Jewish homes when he struck the firstborn. Why does this detail of God passing over become the feature of the whole holiday that's called Passover? And the second question related to that is that God actually calls it the holiday of the matzah. Why do we call it the holiday of Passover? And the answer is that the message of the whole story from Exodus from Egypt is that just like God passed over, sometimes you walk. Walking is gradual steps, measured one at a time. There's one process of life where everything is measured and calculated. But then there's the idea of leaping forward, taking a sprint, going beyond measure. Pesach, to jump over. That even though you're in this position, you could take a big leap and jump into a whole new realm. Just like God passed over, we have that ability to pass over. And so the message of freedom is, in Egypt, there was slaves. There was no ability to go free. But suddenly they will realize that as Jews, they have the ability to sprint, to go beyond what's normal. And this is so fundamental in Pesach, because in life, sometimes you see, what's the difference between walking and jumping? Obviously, to take a jump takes courage, but when you walk, you see the next step in front of you. When you take a jump, you don't know where you're going to land. And in life, some people just want to take steps because they want to see exactly where they're going to go the next step. But if you really want to succeed in life, you have to take a leap. You have to be willing to pass over. And even though you don't know where you're going to land, you have the faith in God. That ties back to the name of the Parshat Bo, come to Pharaoh. God is with me on this jump. I could do it. I could take the leap. And the idea of taking that jump, and that's really all of Jewish history. Nothing in Jewish history makes sense. Everything is leaps and bounds, right? Jumping. And that's the message of the whole holiday of Passover, that when God is with us, we could overcome all obstacles, defy all odds, break all barriers, leap over and beyond what anyone could have expected. And finally, why do we call it Passover? Because Passover, the famous words in Song of Songs, I am to my beloved and my beloved is to me. The story of the Exodus from Egypt is the love story of God and the Jewish people. God chooses the Jewish people, rescues them from Egypt, takes them to Mount Sinai, gives them his Torah, brings them to the land of Israel, establishes them as his nation. And this marriage has gone on for 3,300 years plus. Now, I am into my beloved is unto me. Says Rabbi Yitzchak Barditcheva, that how do you know a couple loves each other? When each one is always complimenting and praising the other one. When each one is putting the spotlight on themselves, that's not a loving marriage. When each one is emphasizing the other one's greatness and goodness, then you see it's a loving marriage. Same thing with God and the Jewish people. God says, this is the holiday of matzah. The Jews are so wonderful. They trusted me. They left Egypt with the dough on their back. They went into a vast desert, not knowing how they're going to live. and survive and sustain themselves, but they trusted me. And sure enough, I took care of them. I gave them the water, the manna from heaven, the water from the well, from the rock. But I'll always remember their faith and trust in God, that they left Egypt with nothing but the dough on their back. That's God extolling our virtues, the bride. We extol God, the groom's virtues, and we say, God, you're the one who saved us. You passed over our homes when you killed the firstborn in Egypt. We love you. Anila dodi vidodi li. And that's really the way the story, everyone knows that Elul, the month, the prelude to Rosh Hashanah is, I am to my beloved is to me. But the story from Exodus from Egypt is also, I am unto my beloved, and my beloved is unto me. But the difference is the direction. In Rosh Hashanah, we come to God first, and then God grants us a good year. In this story, God comes down into Egypt to rescue us, to pull us out. And then we in turn pledge our love to him at Mount Sinai and become his nation. But they're both the two highlights of the year. Rosh Hashanah, which is the universal new year for mankind, Adam and Eve's creation, and Passover, which is the birth of the Jewish nation. They're both love stories, the love of God and the Jewish people, and the love of God and mankind, which is the high holidays, is all of mankind, creation of the world, Adam and Eve, the progenitors of all of mankind. And this is the exclusive story of the Jewish people. Many other laws and ideas in the same. So I just want to go to maybe, again, all the laws of Passover are detailed here. But I'll just go to the very end because I think this is very practical and very relevant. The last commandment in the Torah, the last verse of the Torah portion says, and it shall be for you as a sign on your hand and between your head, which is the mitzvah of tefillin. Why? Because God took you out with an outstretched arm. So one of the reasons for wearing the tefillin, which of course we also recite that commandment in the Shema, is because God says, I took you out with an outstretched arm, and therefore you should wear the tefillin, which will remind you of the story of the Exodus of Egypt, because they're written in those black boxes. And that's a very practical commandment for all men to perform each and every day, with the exception of Shabbat and holidays. And that's another mitzvah that is performed as a commemoration for the Exodus from Egypt. And I'll just conclude by saying that we always hear the term, think out of the box. Well, tefillin says we have to think inside the box. We have to think inside the box, meaning our Jewish roots, our memory of the Exodus from Egypt, which is the Shema, our faith and loyalty and devotion and love to God, the remembrance of the story of the Exodus from Egypt, which are all inside the box. And every day we start our day by thinking inside the box. And what is inside that box? And that's the way we carry the memory of 3,300 years ago, the Exodus from Egypt, which has sustained us as a people, as I said, storytelling. And particularly that we tell the story. You see, the nations of the world tell a different story about the Jewish people, an anti-Semitic story. And we have to make sure we know our story, not the story of the world. And this, I'm just going to conclude by saying that Jewish education is so important. We see the first thing Moses said is educate your children. But you know why it's so important? Because if you don't tell your children your story, they're going to believe the stories that others tell about the Jewish people. And that's not a pretty story. And instead of your child living with faith and confidence and pride in who they are, they're going to live with shame and fear. And you really see that today, that kids who get a Jewish education, they know who they are, they know where they come from, and they're proud. And despite all the anti-Semitism, they don't cower, they don't lower their head in any way. They have confidence and trust and pride in who they are. And no matter what the world says about the Jews, they know who they are, and they live their lives with their heads held up high as proud Jews. But those Jews who their parents and grandparents didn't tell them their own story, they buy into the story of the world about how bad the Jews are and how Israel's apartheid and this and that. Those Jews become ashamed of their own identity, and even worse, they become self-hating Jews. And so especially, and this is really the most important element and crucial message of the Parsha, teach your children the story, let them know who they are and what they stand for, and what a great nation they come from, so they could live a life filled with pride and with confidence. And this is true as a Jewish people and on a personal level. You know, there are many studies, and I'll just conclude with this, that show that the kids who know their personal family history that the parents took the time to tell them about who they are, where they come from. That builds spiritual resilience and confidence in the child. The fact that the child knows, I had a grandfather who went through this hardship and he overcame the Great Depression, or he did this. When the child faces an obstacle, says, yeah, my father told me about his dad back in the day in the war of whatever, when he fought these people or that people. And the kid says, well, I got that in me from my grandfather, from my great-grandfather, from my father. They know the story of their mother, their father, their grandparents. They know that, and the parents tell them to honestly, mom and dad, we went through a hardship one time. We had no money. We were struggling, but we overcame it. We prevailed. Now, when the kid grows up and has a chance to, oh, my mom and dad went through a problem like that too, and they overcame this problem. It's not the end of the world. I don't have to give up. I don't have to despair. I don't have to become depressed. I don't have to become suicidal. There are people who came before me who had struggles and they overcame it. And it's in my DNA because they're my parents and grandparents. That's the story of the Jewish people. When we tell our kids the story of who they come from and what they overcame, that is the greatest gift you can give your child. Not just pride and dignity and honor and not buying into the racist, anti-Semitic lies of the world, but you empower your child, knowing they come from such an amazing people that have endured so much, but persevered and overcame, in a nation that has imbued the world with righteousness and goodness. There's no greater gift. And that's what Moses tells the Jewish people when they leave Egypt. Remember, teach this to your children. The primary night, of course, is the night of Passover. But every day we're supposed to remember the Exodus from Egypt. And putting on the tefillin reminds us and reminds our children and is the vehicle to communicate these lessons from one generation to the next. Wishing everyone a beautiful day. And thank you all for joining us.